So, good evening, everybody, and welcome back on Italian Military Archives. And this evening we have Naval Star with us, Drachenifel. And for, I guess, those of you who are interested in naval stuff, they perfectly know him. Hi, Drac. How are you doing?
Hello. I'm good, thank you. I'm just about set back in the correct time zone, so that's good.
Yeah, I realized I have to be careful when I'm using the AM PM thing because we are not used to it. We
Mm.
use it for me for the 6 p.m. for me would be 18 sharp.
Yeah,
So,
1800.
yeah, 1800. So anyway, hi everybody. We have Alex joining us in the
Mhm.
on the outside. So this evening it wants to be a general chat on the perception that the Royal Navy had on the Italian Regia Marina. Of course, we will focus on the interwar years and on the Second World War. Um, but I would like to recall that for a long period of time, the Regia Marina and the Royal Navy have been allies, and in general, the Italian and British relations were very good. And I always want to recall that the process of Italian unification, so these three wars that stretch from 1848 to 1866, they basically happened because the British Empire was in favor of it because they saw the opportunity of unified state in the center of the Mediterranean that could counterweight France in a way.
Yeah.
And then, of course, this was also in part the cooperation was strengthened in close terms during the First World War with the joint operations going on in the Adriatic between the British, the Italians, and the French, which I believe we will talk about it soon. But we'll, I don't want to spoil other shows coming up.
Yeah.
And yeah, so after the First World War, we have the naval treaties, the Washington Naval Treaty, and we know that the Italians got the parity, the so-called
Mhm.
parity of tonnage allocation vis-a-vis the French, the Marine Nationale. So
Mhm.
in Italy, this was was seen as a victory because Italy was as we know, the least of the great powers, but for the first time was kind kind of recognized the same parity with the French, which was felt by everybody as one of the great powers, the main
Mm.
great powers. So this sparked in the following naval the naval constructions following the Washington
Mhm.
Naval Treaty sparked the Italian-French naval race. I mean, basically, one nation was building something, and the other one was building something else to counter the other construction. So, I would say that this was already happening before. So prior to the First World War and prior
Yeah.
to the dreadnought era, let's say,
Mhm.
before the Italians realized they had to catch up with the shipbuilding program of the Austro-Hungarians. But this is a replication of what was happening already before. So what was the perception of the Royal Navy and of the UK with regards to this naval race, and then we will dig deeper into the ship design
Mm.
issues.
So in the interwar period, obviously coming out of the First World War, the Italians had been fighting on the Allies' side, and certainly in the 1920s, when everybody is sticking to the treaty limits and you've got this kind of informal truce in terms of naval construction between France and Italy, nothing's written down, but everyone kind
Mm.
of understands that, if one side doesn't build something, then the other side won't. And neither French nor the Italian economies are in a particularly brilliant state in the 20s.
Yeah.
So from at that point, the Royal Navy, they've got the Mediterranean. Well, it's still technically called the Mediterranean Fleet, although realistically, if you're going to go by how things are broken down by on paper, it should be the Mediterranean Squadron at that point, which in For the British in the 20s, the Italian fleet it's there. They're not particularly bothered by it because, as far as they're concerned, the most advanced ships that the Italians have, at least in terms of capital ships, are 12-inch gun kind of second generation dreadnoughts, and the British are sort of sailing around with the Queen Elizabeth, the Revenges, and the Nelsons, so they're not worried about the Italians at that point, and they've got some residual positive feelings towards them from the First World War. That starts to change to a certain degree once you get into the 1930s, because first, obviously, you have Mussolini taking over, which, weird as it sounds to people these days, wasn't actually seen as a bad thing overall in Britain in the early 1930s, because I mean, it's kind of similar in some ways to nowadays when people look up archive documents and they realize that, broadly speaking, Britain was in favor of the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War. And these days, people look back at that and go, "Oh, General Franco, brutal dictator. How could they possibly back them?" But then you look at the documentation of the time, and the British government is looking at it in terms of in terms of the Spanish Civil War. They think, the country's going to go far left or far right, and they know what the USSR is like, so they're looking at that as their sort of epitome of a far left government. So that, well, if we have to have one or the other, we'd rather have a far right government because that'll probably be more siding with us. And similarly, when Mussolini takes over, given the various Italian political factions that were in existence before, they view him as someone that they can probably deal with a little bit more than some of the others.
They saw him as somebody able to oppose to the communists and the socialists, which in that time frame of the early 1920s was seen as the main threat. So we have to remember this. And then at the very beginning, Mussolini was the prime minister. I mean, the shift to dictatorship happened in time towards the second half of the 20s. But then it was generally accepted, and the general approach towards Italy was peaceful, and they seeked, and we will see later, they always seek favorable relations with the Italians.
And then as you get into the 20s, I mean, the Italians have started building some ships in the latter part of the 1920s. Some of the early condottieri class, the Trento class heavy cruisers are being built. But broadly, it's kind of like, well, everybody is building some degree of heavy cruisers and modern cruisers and revamping their destroyer fleet. So nobody's particularly, again, they're not particularly bothered going into the early 30s because they're just seeing it as a general and relatively low scale modernization of the Italian fleet. But then as you get towards the middle part of the 1930s, they begin to get a little bit more worried. Because politically, obviously, various factions are forming in Europe, and Italy's increasingly, especially because you've got things like the invasion of Ethiopia and so forth. Italy's beginning to drift further from what Britain sees as its political circle, combined obviously with the rise of Germany, which is beginning to disregard treaties more and more. And then you also have a number of minor incidents which start to give the British a little bit of cause for concern, because the British are very conscious that if the treaty system starts to break down, the only way they can maintain their position, not even necessarily as the number one fleet, because they've kind of ceded equal parity with the States, but to stay at the top level and to secure the empire, they're aware that without a treaty system in place, they're going to need to spend a lot of money on ships. And that, so, or probably of all the major powers, the British are the most pedantic and nitpicky about making sure that everybody is sticking to the treaty, which leads to some really bizarre things in the latter part of the 1930s, like when it's very clear the treaty system is breaking down, the British are still trying to enforce bits of it on everyone, which is, in retrospect and to a certain extent at the time, is seen as a bit silly, but nevertheless. But yeah, in the mid 1930s, you have kind of the Franco-Italian naval arms races really getting going.
because the Italians have already laid down the Littorios in
Yeah.
response to the second Dunkirk. So basically, they are starting again all over.
Yeah, and Britain and a number of others can kind of see this. It's like it's an impossible circle because France is mostly at this point building in response to Germany,
Mhm.
but then the Italians are looking at it and going, well, the French could be at Cherbourg, they could be at Toulon, so we have to build in response, which is kind of what everyone had understood. But then the French are looking at it and going, well, we were building that in response to Germany, but if the Italians are building this in response to that, then we have to build in response to that. And so the French are basically in a semi-unintentional arms race with two separate navies. And anything they build in response to one is going to trigger the other navy to build something in response to them, which basically lands you in this impossible situation of, as you said, the Italians start building the Littorios because of Strasbourg, which prompts the French to build the Richelieus, which prompts the Italians to lay down Impero and Roma, which prompts the French to start considering a second pair of Richelieus, and obviously the war interrupts, but it would have gone on and on and on at that point.
Yeah, I remember this warning message from Admiral Darlan that in response to the laying down of of Roma and Impero, he is worried that the Italian fleet could become larger of the Marine Nationale in a matter of years if the French government doesn't provide the funds to build more ships.
Yeah. And the slightly bizarre thing is that, as you said, like at the time of the Washington Treaty, Italy being seen as being on parity with the French was seen as a big deal. It's like it's elevating Italy or possibly lowering France. I think depends on whose side you're asking. The French weren't especially happy with the idea, but then by the time you get to the mid 1930s. In some ways, actually, the Italian shipbuilding industry, although it's still relatively limited compared to the major powers, has actually come to surpass French shipbuilding, certainly on the larger scale of things. The French still have more shipyards, so if it came down to churning out destroyers and cruisers, assuming they just start throwing money at the problem, they can probably outbuild the Italians. But one of the things in one of the French naval analyses I've read is in particular looking at capital ship construction, and the French are actually very worried because the Italian shipyards have the capability to build multiple Littorio-sized vessels, and the French are looking
two
at
at the time.
And the French are looking at their shipyards and going, we can kind of match that, which is why you get Richelieu and Jean Bart, and then Clemenceau and Gascogne. But the French are building them in yards, at least with Richelieu, where they're having to build the major part of the hull, but the bow and stern separately to attach once the ship is launched. Whereas the Italian shipyards are able to build the whole hull and launch it, which gives them a slight build time advantage. And so
one in Genova and one in Trieste.
Yeah. So then when you're looking at like a long-term naval arms race of 6, 8, 10 battleships, by the time you get to the fourth pair, the Italians are going to end up, several months, if not maybe a year or two ahead, which is making the French very, very nervous, amongst other things. And then, of course, you also have during the 1930s, when the Zara class come into service at the beginning of the 1930s, a lot of people are looking at them and kind of, in some ways scratching their heads, trying to figure out how the Italians have pulled this off, because everyone else is torn between, the speed, protection, firepower balance. And then they're looking at the Zaras and going, well, you've got the firepower, actually quite heavy firepower compared to a lot of heavy cruisers. And they've definitely got the protection and they've got the speed, and somehow they're pulling all this off on what, at least on paper, the ticket says 10,000 tons. And everyone's like, I guess. They kind of think, and to a certain degree, people are prepared to forgive a little bit on that, because they're looking at things like the French Duquesne class, which frankly are pretty awful. And then they're looking at the counties, and then they're looking at, the Americans are changing their ship design quite frequently. They've gone from basically no armor on the Pensacola's to some armor on the Northamptons, and then by the early 30s, they're starting to build the New Orleans class. So people are kind of like, maybe it's kind of it's. I actually read one of the reports from, I think it was 1932, on an evaluation of the Italian fleet, and you can kind of see this dichotomy going on in the report writer's head, because on the one hand he's going, we know the Italians can build some fairly nice ships, so it's not necessarily unreasonable to think that they've cracked how to build a fully balanced treaty era heavy cruiser. And then almost on the next page he's going, but they're the Italians. How they're this small naval power? How can they have figured out what we haven't? It's not quite as bad as reading US reports about the Japanese at the time, but everyone's struggling a little bit to figure this out. And then, of course, Gorizia ends up in Gibraltar's dry dock,
Yeah.
and as with most things, the British are spying on anybody who pops into their shipyards. And they measure the underwater hull form, and they put together their calculations. Like, this is not a 10,000 ton ship.
They cheated.
Yeah. But again, you see this kind of, as I said earlier, this kind of weird dichotomy where the British are, even though this is an early indication the treaty system is breaking down, they don't make too much of a fuss about it. There's a lot of internal angry documentation circulating within the Royal Navy, but politically it's deemed to be not expedient to make a big fuss, largely because they're looking at it and going, well, they estimate Gorizia is about 12,000 tons, and they reckon, well, if we tell everyone that the Italians have built 4 12,000 ton heavy cruisers, then everyone else is going to want to build 12,000 ton heavy cruisers, and we've just got most of the way through building the County class, and we don't want to spend the money at having to design a whole new batch of heavy cruisers. So we're going to try and keep it quiet, and maybe quietly have a word with Italy and hope that they don't do it again. Which is kind of the eternal optimism of the British at that point.
Yeah, no, because I would also like to recall that the Zara class had a belt armor superior to the Deutschland class, which is you don't think about it, but the Zara class had a belt armor of 150 millimeter, while the Deutschland had a 80 millimeter.
Yeah,
of course, the Deutschland class mounted heavier guns, but still, I recorded in the last episode of Armchair Admirals where there was a question popping out. What if the Germans sent a Deutschland class pocket battleship into the Mediterranean? And that would have been useless.
Yeah, tootling around 6 miles behind the Italian line. And the Italian, like, do we have to send a tow cable back or something?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, so at this point, the British are beginning to get a little bit more worried, because they're thinking, okay, now there's a more serious naval build-up. There's modern battleships being built, which is perfectly legal for the Italians to do, because in the Washington Treaty, the French and the Italian navies had been given exceptions to the battleship building holiday, because they'd actually been left with a collection of pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts.
And they didn't have super dreadnought.
No, they didn't have any super dreadnoughts. And in the 1920s, for economic reasons, they'd scrapped, like both sides had scrapped all their pre-dreadnoughts, and the Italians had even scrapped their first dreadnought. So as a result, when they start building the Littorios, which is before everybody else starts laying down King George V and North Carolinas and so forth, it's by treaty, it's perfectly legal for them to do this. But
although also the Littorio will end up breaking the treaty limit.
Yeah. But by this point, the British are looking around going, okay, politically, Italy's getting further away from us. We know that they're now beginning to cheat on the treaty system. And there's a disturbingly large amount of modern ships coming out of Italian shipyards at a point where, as the Royal Navy, we don't have as many modern ships to allocate to the Mediterranean. Because at this point, early mid-1930s, the British are still thinking in large part about the threat from Japan. So and this is another thing that plays into their thinking, because they're looking at it going, okay, we need to have the bulk of the Royal Navy in the Far East if war comes to war. If that happens, if the Italians decide they want even more colonies in Africa, we won't necessarily have the ships available in the Mediterranean to stop them. because a couple of times during the Abyssinian and Ethiopian crises, it was on the edge. Um, but they're also looking at it in terms of the Mediterranean is now the British supply line.
Yeah.
For the majority of the time period of the British Empire, India and the Far East had almost been a semi-separate part because you had to spend so long going around Africa. But with the opening of the Suez Canal in the latter part of the 19th century, now the British government was thinking very much of the empire as a whole unit. But to keep it a whole unit, they had to be able to connect via the Suez Canal. And if they need to go via the Suez Canal, that means they have to go through the Mediterranean. And if they have to go through the Mediterranean, that means they have to go through the central Mediterranean around Sicily and Malta. And that's basically the Italian Navy's home territory. And so even if they don't necessarily think an alliance between the Italians and the Japanese is strictly on the cards, anyone with a map can see that this would be a really good pressure point for somebody to threaten if Britain's at war or in high tension with Japan. The Italians can go, well, it would be a shame if the Mediterranean became impassable for your merchant ships, wouldn't it? Now, if you don't want that to happen, we're perfectly willing, your classic protection racket style, we're perfectly willing to make sure the Mediterranean is perfectly safe for your shipping, but it'll cost you. And if the British aren't prepared to meet those terms, then there could be serious consequences.
Yeah.
And yeah.
No, yeah, I wanted to underline this fact of the Abyssinian crisis because it's very interesting. The British were in the perfect position to stop the Italians from acquiring their overseas empire, because of course they had to move through the Suez Canal. And then also in 1935, when the crisis erupts, because the war goes from October to 1935 to May 1936. So back then, the modernized Cavour are not ready. So the Italians only have the Duilio and Dora in their World War I configuration. And yeah, they have all their heavy cruisers, they have the light cruisers, but for instance, the two Abruzzes are not ready by then. So yeah, on paper is a full cruiser navy. They already have a considerable number of submarines, and they have the Regia Aeronautica. In what I read is that back then, in general, the world opinion and the British were worried about the threat level posed by the Italian Air Force, because back then they seemed advanced, but there was also not very good intelligence on their actual capabilities. So this was an on paper threat, but still to be considered. And I wanted to bring up this paper that I put the reference in the description. Is a very nice paper from Richard Hammond. And he it's called An Enduring Influence on Imperial Defense and Grand Strategy, British Perception of the Italian Navy from 1935 to 1943. And here I collected some of the most interesting quotes that they're put here. And this refers to the period of the Ethiopian crisis. So the British are basically thinking on how to deal with Italy with this crisis, because we have a member of the League of Nations threatening of invasion, another member of the League of Nations. So, and they are in the perfect position to stop this from happening. But in the end, this does not happen. And this is a quote from I think a meeting minute of the chiefs of staff. It says, "It is of paramount importance to British strategical interest that we should be free from commitments in the Mediterranean if our defense arrangements are to prove adequate to deal with the threat of hostilities in the Far East." Again, the Japanese threat that you mentioned. Or at home, and to give us breathing space in which to recondition the service. It is evident that to achieve this, we must return as soon as possible to a state of friendly relations with Italy. Because in general, the perception was that, of course, we can win against the Italian fleet, but this will cost perhaps too much. That will jeopardize our ability to keep control of the empire and to face the Japanese threat. So this was mainly the problem.
Yeah, and it one of the things in some ways that comes back to bite Italy a little bit when it comes to the Second World War, as it historically bears out, but at the time in the mid 1930s is a major concern, is that Italy is in some ways one of the very first European powers to start fully modernizing its military. So when it comes to sort of 1936, 1937, you have British analysis looking at Italian, as you said, Italian aircraft with the Regia Aeronautica, as well as the Italian fleet that's currently under construction. And everything's a couple of years ahead of what everyone else is doing. You look at kind of the Italian fighter planes, Italian torpedo bombers and level bombers in the sort of, let's say, 1936 to 1938 period. And they all look a generation or two ahead of what you might find on British airfields, and that's because they are. As I said, the problem in retrospect, the problem that they then have is that they've done this massive, expensive modernization, and then you have one more generation of advancement before the war breaks out, which then leaves them at something of a disadvantage in some cases. But in the mid 1930s, no one knows that we're going to be at war in 1939, so everyone's looking at this vast modern air force and upcoming navy and going, this could be more of a problem than we thought. It's also about periods of vulnerability, which is obviously where this chief of staff report is coming from. Because even if they're confident that, oh yeah, we can come along with our own fighters, bombers, new ships, etc., and regain our technical superiority, that's not going to be for 3 or 4 years down the line. And in the 1930s, you've got political crises dropping left, right, and center. At the time that this report is written, Japan is on its way out of the naval treaty system, so everything's happening at once, and they're getting quite worried. And to a certain degree, even with all that said, the fact that they're very concerned about this combination of air and sea power in the Mediterranean, particularly because it's such an enclosed environment, will actually be borne out during the Second World War. It's something that a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate, because when you think of aircraft attacking ships at sea during World War II, most people's immediate thoughts go to the Pacific War. But what they don't necessarily realize is that 1942, and to a certain extent even in a good chunk of 1943 in the Pacific, when you're talking about carrier battles and carrier strikes and so forth, you're talking about strikes of maybe 24 aircraft, if you're lucky, in a single strike. And if you're talking about a multi-carrier battle, you might have 2 or 3, maybe 4 waves that size involved over the course of a day, and then it's over, because everyone's done their strikes, various ships are on fire, everybody's patching themselves up and withdrawing and so forth. But that's 42, 43, whereas in the Mediterranean in 1940, 1941, and in 1942, you're talking about airstrikes that are coming in where the individual waves of aircraft are 40, 60, even 80 aircraft strong, and they're hitting, they're going away, and then a couple of hours later, another 20, 40, 60 aircraft are showing up, and then another 20, 40, 60 aircraft are showing up. So you have the various convoy runs, mostly heading to Malta. Sorry, I'll just get this Alexa to shut up. Sorry. So you've got these various air attacks on convoys and stuff, and you chart up the number of actual sorties flown, and it's like 200, 300, 400 sorties flown over the course of several days, constantly attacking these ships. And that's actually the single largest continuous set of airstrikes that you'll see enacted on ship formations until probably mid 1944, when the US just starts throwing massive swarms of Essex class carriers at anything they think is a problem. This is all happening like 2-3 years earlier.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't know
No
why.
worry.
I don't know why. Suddenly, I'm very popular with Alexa. Anyway, so yeah. So and this is all happening in 40, 41, 42. So to a certain extent, it's actually bearing out a lot of the concerns that are in these mid 1930s reports, which is
Yeah.
something that people don't usually appreciate.
Yeah, and then I will add to this that then, as you mentioned, the Italians are advanced in the mid 1930s, but then the commitments in the Ethiopian invasion, the commitments in the Spanish Civil War, basically drag all these resources needed for research and development, and of course this keeps the Italian behind in terms, especially of aircraft, because I would say that of the three armed forces, the three Italian armed forces, the Regia Marina had a lot of problems, of course, but of the three, it was the one most ready to fight in a way. The Regia Aeronautica proved to be really not up to the task, especially in the first year of war, already in the first year of war, and of course the army. We perfectly know that they didn't have modern tanks at the onset of the war. They developed them during the war, and they were not they don't have necessarily the bad reputation they have received. The Bovington Tank Museum did a great video on the M14 tank, and they basically say, yeah, these tanks do not deserve the bad reputation they have received in all this time. So, but if you have, let's say, a learning curve in the army, a learning curve in the Regia Marina, the Regia Aeronautica doesn't improve that much, and they are absolutely not up to the task, so they cannot even provide the reconnaissance support and attack support over the seas. And yeah, they develop a torpedo bomber capability, but of course the numbers are not high, and also the bombing campaign against Malta. We know that even the number of, if I remember correct, the first bombing over Malta of Italian aircraft was carried out with like 10 aircraft. So the number of aircraft in each wave was not that much because the serviceable aircraft were not many.
Mm-hmm.
And also you had a lot of problems with crew trainings because of course you had limited reserves of fuel, and then you could not spend too much hour training pilots because otherwise you would consume too much fuel.
Yeah.
And then and in fact at the beginning of the hostilities, the Regia Marina has around 1 million tons of naphtha, naval fuel, and they receive or immediately the visit of the ministry, I think the Ministry of the Colonies and of the Regia Aeronautica, because yeah, we need to borrow 250,000 tons of fuel. So you have to consider all these problems, and the so this was to say that on paper, yeah, in the 1930s it was reasonable to think that the combined threat of the cruiser force, the submarines, and the aircraft posed a remarkable threat. And I discovered it while I was reading Richard's paper. The Mediterranean fleet moved its base from Malta to Alexandria, right in the middle of the Ethiopian crisis, because of this perceived threat that Malta was a possible target, an easy target for the Italian Air Force. But then, of course, we will see that this will not be the case. The Italian Air Force would have been will be a bluff, let's say, because everybody, even the Italians, overestimated their capabilities. And then basically all the burden was to be brought forward by the Regia Marina during the war.
Yeah, although it does also show some of the, I wouldn't say limitations, but it shows some of the balances in terms of decision making that you have to make when it comes to aircraft strike packages. Because as you said, there's not huge. When you look at the numbers of aircraft that show up to attack convoys with bombs and torpedoes, and then you look at the numbers of aircraft that show up over Malta in any given flight, you can look at it and think, well, hang on, Malta is the destination of the convoy. The convoy, therefore, is further away when it's attacked. So how are they showing up at the convoy with more aircraft than they are over Malta? But part of it is because if you're going after ships, you tend to carry relatively few armor-piercing bombs because you're only going to get one attack run. And so you try and take, roughly speaking, the biggest that you can get. But that volumetrically wise might actually fill your bomb bay before you've got anywhere close to full load. And likewise, a torpedo is a big heavy weapon in and of itself, but you're probably only carrying the one. Whereas if you're going to try saturation bombing of a city or an island, you pack as many bombs as you physically can in there, and that means that strike aircraft that are trying to do bombing of Malta will actually be carrying considerably larger payloads overall than strike aircraft that are going after ships at sea. And that in turn means that you've got shorter range, which is going to limit the number of and types of aircraft you can send over. And they're more vulnerable because they're heavily loaded, so they're a bit slower. And so you end up with this slight paradox of actually being able to send more aircraft out to attack targets further away because they're loaded with anti-shipping payloads than going after Malta with saturation bombing payloads. And when by the time Fliegerkorps 10 get over there and start attacking as well, they have the same issue. Again, a lot of people forget, which is kind of influences a lot of the wartime reports as well, that when Fliegerkorps 10 comes along, yes, they're operating Stukas and so forth in the anti-shipping role, but the Germans also give a lot of Stukas to the Regia Aeronautica. So obviously in a lot of British reports, they see, Stukas, right, we must be being bombed by the Germans because it's a German aircraft and everyone knows what it is. But actually a good chunk of the time it's Italian Stukas.
Yeah, at least one bomb from an Italian flown Stukas were arrived on the HMS Illustrious in early 1941. Of course, it was in the middle of many other German Stukas, so it was impossible to recognize them.
But even the Stukas have this issue of, like, when the British are operating very close to their bases, they can haul out 2,200 pound or 1,000 kilo bombs, anti-shipping bombs, but a lot of the time they can only haul out lighter weight bombs because that allows them to get further away to drop the strikes.
Yeah, and I mean, I would also recall that the bombing of Malta was seen as a way to neutralize the island as a threat to the Axis supply lines running in the central Mediterranean. It was not necessarily, hitting the convoys was a thing, and trying to prevent these convoys to reach Malta was a thing. But the Italian Navy was generally unsuccessful in doing that in 1940, 1941. In 1942, things will change because they managed to, they understood how to behave, let's say, in this regard, and they have reached a better degree of cooperation with the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica. In fact, you will have the second Sirte, you will have the other convoys slaughtered in February, and then you will have Harpoon, Vigorous, and Pedestal. But the idea was to neutralize Malta in order to prevent it to harm the supply lines, because they studied, there are lots of discussion, if the Italians invaded Malta in 1940. The Italians had no means to launch an amphibious invasion, because we saw it the year before. Everybody forgets it. The year before, there's the Italian invasion of Albania, which is in a way Mussolini's reply to Hitler occupying Czechoslovakia. And there you have basically the landing party being formed by the sailors, armed sailors, disembarking from the torpedo boats, landing, and then making way for the transport ships to enter the harbor and offload the small L3 tanks and the soldiers. This was how the amphibious operation was carried on. So I've been to Malta. I've seen the most of the coastline is, let's say, hard to approach.
Yes.
There are some beaches, especially in the western part. But again, these beaches then are, after the beach you have a hill, a rocky hill. I guess there were few roads back then. So it is hard to launch an invasion in such condition, and especially if you don't have the means to launch this.
Yeah, and I mean it's another thing is a lot of people forget during the invasion of Crete, there's the
Hmm.
parachute element, which everybody has heard about,
Yeah.
but there's also a fairly major seaborne element that goes horribly, disastrously wrong, and basically they all end up either running away or getting sunk, which nobody seems to have ever heard about. But the other thing is, as you mentioned, you've got kind of got two things working at the same time, because you've got the Italian Navy figuring out how to conduct operations against Malta and its convoys, and as you said, by like 42, they've kind of hit their stride a bit on that. But simultaneously, in 1940, 1941, the Royal Navy is basically it's fighting the Italians and the Germans. So the Royal Navy is split two ways. In 1942, you've added fighting the Japanese into the
Japanese.
equation. So now all of a sudden they're having to divert significant resources over there. So, in 1940, I mean, especially in 1940, because in 1940, the Germans don't have any full-size battleships in service. They've got the Scharnhorsts, but, you don't need a tremendous capital ship fleet to keep two Scharnhorsts locked down. So with the Italians as the only other major threat, if it looks like the Italians are assembling an invasion force for Malta, the Royal Navy can actually put a significant amount of resources in the Mediterranean to counter that. Weirdly enough, 2 years further down the line, if they tried invading in like March or April 1942, just looking at it from an on-paper perspective, the Royal Navy would have had far less to throw at them, at the problem. And, the elements of the US Atlantic Fleet that end up helping out the Royal Navy in the mid part of World War II aren't there yet either.
Yeah.
So it would have, if there was ever a good time to invade Malta, and really there never was a good time, but if there was a marginally less bad time to invade Malta, it was probably early 1942.
Mm-hmm.
By
True.
which point, to be honest, it's a bit late at that point in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, yeah, but again, on paper, the Italian consideration of neutralizing Malta by using air power made sense, because if you don't have means to invade the island, yeah, it makes sense. But then the Italian Navy was also a victim of the bluff of the Italian Air Force in
Yeah.
a way, so they also suffer from it. And then we can add the one of the major flaws and problems of the Regia Marina that many people seems to forget. They only concentrate on the use and non-use of the battleship force, which in my opinion was wisely used. There are some, let's say, arguable decisions in 1940, but overall it was given the strategic situation of Italy, the battleship force was wisely used. The main problem was that given the fact that the Italians conceived to wage a war against the French and basically never against the British. I mean, the eventuality to fight the British came at a very late stage, and for this eventuality, they kind of speed up the development of the human torpedo, the explosive motor boats, which also came a bit late. The Italians didn't develop good anti-submarine warfare capability. They had no sonar devices. Basically, they received some German-built sonar devices towards the end of 1941, but until then, anti-submarine warfare was carried out only with hydrophones, which are not very reliable in operational conditions, and high sight, and that's it. So that I think it's a major flaw that has an origin in the type of war that they thought they would have fought. Because if you're thinking to fight the French in the Western Mediterranean with your very fast cruisers launching a guerrilla style attack like they did in the Adriatic, because there's the Italian thinking was very deeply influenced by what they did in the First World War in the Adriatic. So you have the development of the mass boats, and you have the doctrine of the submarine. So the submarine has to stay unmoved in one area and wait for somebody to pass. This can work in the Adriatic, but it can hardly work in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that there's two things when it comes to how much of a threat was the Italian battle fleet in 1940-41. How well did they? Because this is the thing. It's like how well they manage their fleet is going to dictate how much of a threat they're perceived as. And I think there's two things that people sometimes forget. I mean, people go on about Taranto quite a bit, and yes, for good reason. It was a fairly impressive achievement with relatively small numbers of aircraft, but you don't take the risk of originally throwing two of your fleet carriers, and it ended up being just the one because Eagle had engine problems. But you don't put two of your fleet carriers right up next to the enemy coastline and risk some of your best torpedo bomber squadrons in an operation like Taranto if that enemy isn't a threat. If you don't think the Italian fleet is a threat, you don't take that risk. You just let them sit in port if you don't think they're going to come out. And the other thing is when you look at the deployment of Royal Navy ships on a global scale, obviously 1942 onwards, when Japan gets involved, it gets a lot harder to calculate out. But when you look at, again, 1940-41, you look at the home fleet, and the home fleet capital ship strength and cruiser strength is basically made up of what is the minimum force we think we need to contain a potential German breakout for commerce raiding. At the time that, well, in the immediate run-up to Operation Rheinenburg, when Bismarck breaks out, at that point, the home fleet actually only consists of 3 battleships, and Prince of Wales is brand new. Off of an ostensible, allowing for war losses, but they are bringing in King George V, but allowing for an ostensible Royal Navy capital ship of 15, the home fleet is very often only 3 or 4 ships. The single biggest commitment of capital ship strength in 40 and 41 is the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean fleet based at Alexandria usually has 3 or 4 capital ships, so they're usually about on a parity with the home fleet. But you've also got Force H at the other end of the Mediterranean.
Because Force H was established to cope with the fact that the French Navy had disappeared from the table.
And Force H
and the Hood was part of Force H, right?
Yes, for a good chunk of time, Hood was part of it. Force H was averaged about 3 capital ships in strength for a good chunk of 1940. It goes down to eventually basically being Renown and Ark Royal for a bit, but then it gets built up again at various points. So if you look at the overall Royal Navy capital ship strength commitment to the Mediterranean, on average, they're committing anywhere between 5 and 8 capital ships in 1940 and 41, depending on what month you're looking at, to the Mediterranean effort, which actually makes it their single greatest capital ship commitment. Then you've got the home fleet, and then kind of you have all the second liner ships and ships in need of a refit and so forth, which are doing various convoy escort missions or going up to annoy various Vichy French possessions in Africa. But these are all kind of detachments of 1 or 2 capital ships at a time, maybe 3 on the convoy routes. But the single largest commitment is the Mediterranean. And again, if the Italians are badly managing their fleet and not seen as a threat, why would the Royal Navy commit a ton of strength to contain them?
And then another thing it's interesting to notice that we talked about the management of the Italian battle fleet. You see that in the moments when the Royal Navy has to organize convoy operation towards Malta, and you have both the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto operational, you see the biggest deployment of forces from the Royal Navy, and it's true for Operation Halberd. It's true for Operation Vigorous and Harpoon. because they are perceived a huge threat. So you see a proportional relation between the two littorals operational, and you see a lot of naval assets coming to the Mediterranean. Yeah, in the case of Operation Halberd, the Italians decided to not. I mean, they ventured at sea, but then they decided to not intercept, because according to Super Marina, and also from the evaluations they received from the reconnaissance, they perceived they were not in the condition of clear superiority in which they could risk the fight, because we have to remember that the directives from Super Marina, the Navy High Command, dictated that they can engage the enemy fleet only in conditions of clear superiority. But this was reflected by the limited availability of ships that the Italian had. They were fighting the largest navy in the world. They were perhaps the fifth navy in the world, so they had to constantly make economy of ships, especially of the valuable Littorio class battleships.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, what it's again this kind of comparison of, it's one of the ways I'd like to evaluate any navy, is like, what were their enemy doing? Because you can make assessments of a navy whatever you want, however you want to do, but if you look at what their enemy is doing, that gives you a clue as to how effective their enemies are perceiving them to be. And as you mentioned, the various convoy escorts, you look at what were the single biggest forces that the Royal Navy alone mustered against enemy forces. Okay, like in 43, 44, there's some multiple battleships and carriers and everything patrolling off of Norway and annoying the Germans there, but that's because half of them are American. But in the first half of the war, the single biggest concentration of force that the Royal Navy brings to bear is initially some home fleet sweeps right at the beginning of the war, when it's just the Germans, which is understandable. It's one opponent, they're right on your doorstep, that's where you have a big fleet assembly. But once the Italians are involved, the single biggest concentration of force you'll see against the Germans is the hunt for Bismarck, which at any given time, in terms of forces actually on mission, as it were, actually in contact with the enemy, is maximum 2 capital ships. Admittedly, obviously, partly because Hood gets blown up and everything, but at any given point, there's 2 capital ships in contact with Bismarck and a carrier in the offing. Then you look at the escorts that are provided for various convoys, and there's 3-4 battleships, multiple aircraft carriers, multiple squadrons of cruisers, 3 or 4 destroyer flotillas, and that's not even a case of there's an enemy naval force to go and engage it. That's a case of we're escorting a convoy. It may or may not be attacked by enemy surface forces, but we need to put enough forces in there just in case.
Yeah.
And suddenly, that's a display of strength that's significantly in excess of what they rate any individual Kriegsmarine threat to be. So it kind of gives another idea of the balance of where the Royal Navy is seeing the balance of forces in these events.
Yeah, and when you say this, I think about this very little known Operation White, which was this club run operation in which HMS Argus had launched 12 Hurricanes to reinforce Malta, and this happens on the 17th of November 1940, so 5 days after Taranto. The Italian Navy has relocated to Naples. The HMS Argus is coming from Gibraltar with a relatively weak escort. So the Admiral Campioni ventures at sea with the Vittorio Veneto and the Giulio Cesare and the rest of the cruiser force. They do not intercept the British, but the Somerville receives news that the Italians are at sea, and he decides to launch the fighters in advance. So at the end of the story, only 4 fighters arrive on Malta because the others cannot make it with their autonomy. And then Somerville turns back. And then for the next operation, Operation Collard, happening 10 days after, which will eventually end up in the Clash of Cape Spartivento. He requests a higher escort, and he deploys the Ark Royal, the Renown, and there's also the movement of the the Ramillies, I think, was
Mhm.
the from the Mediterranean fleet to the Force H to reinforce the Atlantic operations. There's a considerable deployment of forces.
Yeah.
Then, yeah, you have the clash. Admiral Campione, in the end, decides not to risk his force. He has the Vittorio Veneto and the Giulio Cesare, but then in that moment, he's responsible for the only two operational battleships because three are immobilized in Taranto and one is not
Mm.
operational. And then he has Taranto in mind. That happened 2 weeks before. So with an aircraft carrier at sea and then another battleship and a battle cruiser with despair of destroyers. I mean, he has
Mm.
way less destroyers. Yeah, he has the advantage of heavy cruisers, but I mean, I can find his decision acceptable given what he knew and given the position he was put. He's often criticized, and in fact, he will be replaced by Admiral Iachino in
Mm.
the aftermath of the battle. But
Yeah, it's one of those. It's
yeah.
one of those interesting confrontations, really, in some ways, because, as you said, he Campione's out there with the only operational battleships that the Italians have. So, to a certain degree, Somerville has a bit more of a free hand because, okay, yeah, losing Ramillies is going to sting, but nobody's particularly going to miss it. It's like we've got others, and losing Renown would be a bigger deal because it's a modernized battle cruiser, but Renown's also pretty quick and pretty lucky, so they're relatively confident it'll survive. And it means that the Royal Navy can afford to be a bit more aggressive. And there, when you look at it, as you said, from a strategic picture, it makes more sense as to what happened. Although, again, in terms of where you happen to rate your opponents, I'd again fall back to a comparison between, because we don't see that many surface-to-surface engagements between the British and the Japanese, but when you see surface-to-surface engagements with the Germans and with the Kriegsmarine and the Royal Navy, when you look at something like the Battle of Barents Sea or the Battle of North Cape, and basically anything post-Channel Dash, post-Bismarck, the Royal Navy is quite happy to go charging in against disproportionate odds. Barents Sea, there's a Deutschland there, which technically is the thing with the heaviest firepower. The Royal Navy's like, yep, don't care, we're going to shoot at it anyway. North Cape, the first set of confrontations is Scharnhorst, which is a full-on battleship against two town class and a county class cruiser. And again, the British are like, yeah, we don't care, we're just going to shoot at you till you go away. Whereas when you look at a lot of the engagements that the British fight with the Italian fleet, it's a lot more back and forth. The British don't just look at them and go, oh yeah, great, enemy ships, we shall attack them. Even in the run up to Matapan, which a lot of people, obviously Matapan, everyone talks about the night action, but in the run up to that, you have the British cruisers, they run into the Italian heavy cruisers.
There you
they
are.
take one look at it and go, and the British take one look at the Italian heavy cruisers and go, nope. And spend most of the day running as fast as they possibly can in the direction of Cunningham and his battleships, laying smoke screens and everything, because they are not confident that they can take on the Italian heavy cruisers in a straight up fight. And then Vittorio Veneto shows up and scares them even more. And you read some of the accounts from the men who are on the ships, and they're just like, at the point that Vittorio Veneto is there, they're looking at it and going, well, there's Italian heavy cruisers over there, there's an Italian battleship over there, we can't seem to get away from any of them. We really, really, really hope that Warspite and the rest of the battleships turn up some point soon, otherwise we're in a lot of trouble. And then Formidable's aircraft show up, and the whole thing flips around to the narrative that eventually leads to the night action. But you don't find in the Atlantic or the North Sea or the Arctic Ocean, at no point do you find a large formation of Royal Navy cruisers running into a German formation and going, oh, we better withdraw to friendly backup. It's only when they're fighting the Regia Marina that the Royal Navy starts playing this game of keep away.
Mm, mm, mm. And I have a question regarding since we talk about before we talk about Crete. We know that the Royal Navy and the Mediterranean Fleet
Mm,
committed a lot of naval assets in
mm,
the campaign and in the evacuation of the troops there, and they paid a heavy toll in terms of ships lost, mainly due to the Luftwaffe
yeah.
intervention. From the Italian side, there's a discussion on whether why the Regia Marina didn't participate in the action, why they didn't show up. And back then, I mean, the Littorio was operational. Also the Vittorio Veneto had just finished
Hmm.
the repairs after Matapan. The the thing is they didn't received, I mean, with Matapan and the failed operation in mind, in which
Mm,
the Italians complained that they didn't receive enough air cover from both the Germans and the Italian aircraft deployed in the
mm,
Dodecanese. They assessed that there were not enough aircraft to cover the airborne invasion and the Regia Marina, the Italian battle fleet at the same time. So they decided not to engage, not to commit in the campaign. But this is a thing I want to study a bit more. But what's the main reason behind the heavy commitment of the Royal Navy in the campaign? Were they uh, gambling against an intervention of the Regia Marina? Were trying to scare them off, or otherwise what?
well, it's a combination of things. Partly is obviously Crete is a fallback position. They've fallen back from Greece, so there's at this point there's still a fair degree of resupply to be done. That's why you have like HMS York in Suda Bay and so forth, because the Royal Navy is still running quite a number of escorted convoys to just try and bring more supplies, bring more troops, etc., into Crete, and also to a certain extent, there's limited evacuations, at least in the early part of the
Mm,
establishing Crete as well, that are coming across from Greece. Plus, you've got the fact that British intelligence is aware of the fact that any attack on Crete will involve a naval element. As it turns out, it's an unescorted naval element, which doesn't end very well, as we said earlier. But they don't know that. What they know is that any invasion of Crete will involve some form of amphibious landing, and they assume, therefore, that there must be a actual warship component to that, because surely who would be insane enough to send a bunch of unescorted troop ships in? um, and uh, and then on top of that, they're also aware that um, at the state that Crete is in at the time, it doesn't have the world's greatest anti-shipping or anti-aircraft defenses. It's basically troops, not a lot of heavy equipment. At which point, the only real there's no coastal batteries. So if you want to defend against marauding warships, you need the Navy. If you're going to defend against air attack, probably the naval combined anti-air is the best approach. And then once it becomes very clear that, so that's kind of the run up, it explains why the Navy is quite committed. But then once it becomes clear that they are going to be needing to evacuate Crete, they've got experience, but by this point the Royal Navy is fairly experienced with evacuating people from failed ground operations, and they're perfectly aware that the air threat is a major problem. The seaborne threat in this case is a major problem. So there is the possibility that the Regia Marina might show up, but they also know from Dunkirk, from Greece, from all sorts of places that if you have isolated ships, you can run in at night, pick up a few hundred people, and get away again. But that's not going to work for Crete. There's an awful lot of people that they need to evacuate, and if they're going to need to evacuate that many people, that many supplies, etc., that means the operations have to go on day and night. And if the operations are going to go on day and night, and there's going to be a significant air threat, that means they're going to have a fair number of ships there just to defend each other. And then you
Okay.
multiply that by the fact they know there's some kind of amphibious force coming, so you've got to have basically self-escorting forces, which means there's a minimum size force. You've got to have a self-escorting force to deal with the amphibious operation, except that they then decide, well, we don't know where it's coming from, so we need to have multiple groups to cover that that area. One of them will run into them, but each of those has to be self-escorting. So each of those is a fairly substantial commitment. And then if you're going to commit that many destroyers and cruisers to the anti-amphibious part, even if you don't necessarily think there's a high probability of the Regia Marina coming out to play, you know that if they do, given that, you know, the biggest and most powerful ship in the anti-amphibious operation is a town class light cruiser, if the Italian heavy cruisers and battleships come out to play, you need the heavy ships there to back up your ships, hence Warspite and Valiant. So it's kind of this big snowball of escalating factors, which then ends up with loads of ships being present. And then unfortunately, because they've basically distributed them in what they call in British terms penny packets, lots of individual groups of small groups of ships, you end up with this series of confusing orders where you end up with ships being damaged, ships being mined, ships being bombed, because they're in a lot of cases because they've just flat out run out of anti-aircraft ammunition. Which is another major problem, like we were talking before in the Mediterranean, about the fact you can be attacked day and night consistently on an ongoing basis. You know, in the Pacific, you're not going to run out of AA ammo in a single engagement, even if it lasts several hours. But if you've been fighting for several days, that when you start looking through every magazine you've got, you're like, we literally have nothing left to throw into the air.
Yeah, that makes me think about Operation Vigorous, because if I remember correctly, when the convoy running from Alexandria to Malta had no battleships; they only had destroyers and light cruisers. While Giacchino ventured with the remaining heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 2 littorios, and so he was marching towards them, constantly attacked, and on the way he lost the Trento, the heavy cruiser Trento. And then the Vian basically made some turns just to wait in the hope that Giacchino would have withdrawn in the face of submarine air attacks. But then at some point they realized that Giacchino is not retreating, and then they decided to withdraw and abort the mission. But one of the factors that played out in their decision was that they were under attack by German and to a minor extent Italian airplanes, and they consumed a lot of anti-aircraft ammunition. So you still have a big chunk of the Mediterranean to cross, and you are running out of ammo. It's basically a suicide.
Yeah, I mean, after Crete, there were standing orders put in place for the Royal Navy that basically said, if you fall below this percentage of your anti-aircraft ammunition, that's essentially what we consider you need to survive to get home. So you turn around and go home. And it's considerably higher percentage than they were prepared to risk before Crete.
Yeah, then getting back to Crete, I remember that you mentioned this amphibious operation launched. I recall that I was reading this paper on the Italian participation in the Battle of Crete, in which there was, most of you may not know that there was an Italian landing at the far east of the island that basically went unopposed, because the battle was fought in the center and western. But then there were 2 convoys of that were carrying German, I think, Alpenjäger, so mountain troops, and they were basically a group of 10 to 12 wooden ships sailing with equipped with sails. And then they were escorted by a single Italian torpedo boat. One was the Lupo, one was the Sagittario, and they came across this British formations, I think consisting of 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers. And in the case of the Lupo, the Lupo basically signals the convoy to withdraw, and then lays an insane smoke screen and tries to shoot at the enemy. They even come very close. And I think in the case of the Lupo, there's a report that the British ships ended up firing at each other because they were the Lupo was in behind. So a very messy fight. But then the convoys, of course, is slow because they are wooden ships with sails, and then part of the convoys is sunk, but don't the entire convoy. And in the case of the Sagittario incredibly manages to shield the convoy, delay the British formation, and the convoy gets back to Greece. So, and then I read that the Kriegsmarine command of based in Athens was very critical about the plan, this amphibious commitment that was basically ordered by the Luftwaffe, because the Luftwaffe was in charge of the uh, of the whole operation, and the Kriegsmarine command in the Aegean was basically subject to the Luftwaffe command. But yeah, funny note. And apparently the Kriegsmarine didn't blame the Italians for this partial failure of the amphibious landing. They blamed the Luftwaffe because of the poor planning.
Yeah, to be honest, no one really comes out of Crete looking particularly brilliant, with the possible exception of the New Zealand formation that held the airfield for a bit, because the Luftwaffe sinks a bunch of Royal Navy ships, but as you mentioned, basically ends up getting the Fallschirmjäger shot to pieces, and a bunch of pressure transports destroyed. The Royal Navy manages to evacuate Crete, but is left with a huge butcher's bill of damaged and sunken ships. Everyone's kind of looking at each other going, well, that was almost an equal disaster for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, now I would like to raise an off-topic question that comes from the audience. Actually, it comes from Mirko, who's following us, because it's very interesting. So, as the battleships in World War II become obsolete compared to carriers and air power, talking about now, do you think that carriers are obsolete versus hypersonic missiles, high-speed torpedoes, and so on?
Oh, that's coming forward into the modern era. Well,
yeah.
Fair enough. I suppose as an opinion piece, since I'm not doing it on my channel or anything, I don't think carriers are necessarily obsolete, but I do think that they are perhaps slightly victims of their own reputation at the moment. So I think if it comes to things like hypersonic missiles, saturation airstrikes, long-range torpedoes, and so forth, I think that it is still possible to defend a carrier, but I think that a lot of the modern escort groups are too small. People they've started thinking of carriers as kind of this almost holy thing. It is the
perhaps.
thing. Yeah, and they're beginning to, in some ways, almost think of them as, because they're the centerpiece of the fleet, they're really difficult to sink. And it's like, that's not actually the case. The carriers are a little bit difficult to sink because of their sheer size, but at the same time, carriers don't have the same self-defense capability unless they get their air group in the air as almost anybody else does. And yeah, when you look at the modern escort groups, where they're talking about maybe 4 ships, if that, and sometimes less, a 4-ship escort group could be overwhelmed by those kind of weapons, especially because the other area which I think they've become vulnerable is that both escorts and carriers nowadays are trying to do everything, which means you actually have, compared to your notional capability, you actually have a relatively small self-defense capability. So I think they need to expand carrier escort groups, and they also need to more monotask them.
We have a suggestion here.
I know it's more of a build prompts question, but hey, Mirko asked it, so I think they need to more monotask them, because just very briefly before we get back to World War II, to use an example of an American carrier battle group, if you've got your Arleigh Burkes, and they've got they're carrying some anti-ballistic missiles, they're carrying some Tomahawks, they're carrying some harpoons, and somewhere in there they might actually have some surface-to-air missiles. So if at that point you actually have a lot fewer surface-to-air missiles than you might think you have on paper, whereas if you have 6 ships, then you can go, right, well, this vessel is going to carry all of our anti-shipping, anti-surface missile component, our ballistic missile component, with a minimal self-defense capability, and then you pack all the others with surface-to-air missiles, then you actually might have a chance at knocking down a mass strike with hypersonics. So yeah, I think that's a very long form way of saying the way they're currently laid out, yes, carriers are probably vulnerable to those weapons, but there is a way to make them considerably less vulnerable.
Yeah, makes me think about the same discussion that goes on for tanks. That the tanks is the era of tanks over? No, people are saying, yeah, you can defend tanks, but yeah, let's not go too much off topic. Let's save it for another talk.
Yeah.
Then maybe we could devote just to close. Maybe we can close this section on the let's say the threat perception with yet another quote that Richard Hammond reports in the paper. And actually, a quote from Admiral Cunningham from late 1942. I think Operation Torch has already happened when he makes this quote. So basically, he says, as long as the Italian fleet is in being and in a position to interfere, a considerable force of capital ships and therefore cruiser is required. The Italian fleet will be a constant nuisance and menace to true convoys in the Mediterranean, and it must be our object to render it ineffective as soon as possible. So, I mean, this is interesting because it comes at in a moment when the situation is in North Africa is compromised for the Axis, and the British probably don't know yet, but the Italians have no naphtha reserves left, so they are basically not a non-threat. But it's interesting because it makes me think about the the claims of the moral ascendancies gained after the Battle of Calabria, or the various claims made after Taranto. And I mean, this goes in the direction of what what Richard says in the paper and what we have talked so far, that you don't commit so much naval assets if you're not perceiving this opponent a threat. That this opponent can be as ineffective as it can be, as it was in some occasion and in some field, like as I mentioned, night fighting or anti-submarine warfare. But it's a very interesting quote, I believe, and it links up with the thing that people have when they look at naval operations. They always have to take into account the strategic picture, I think, more than land operations.
Yeah, and it's I'm just trying to find an exact listing, but when you look at Operation Husky, i.e. the invasion of Sicily, again, you look at the sheer number of warships committed to that. Yes, there's a bombardment force and a close escort for the convoy, for the invasion convoys, but there's actually a absolutely huge, for the time, commitment of capital ships and so forth to the covering force. The bombardment force has its own capital ships and so forth as kind of backstops, but there's an entire major fleet commitment made just for a covering force, just in case the Regia Marina comes out to interfere. And Operation Husky is nowhere near as large as D-Day. But when you look at the D-Day landings, yes, there's a number of battleships there. There's quite a few battleships present at D-Day. But apart from Rodney, which is kind of sitting back as a reserve, all the battleships at D-Day are committed to just the shore bombardment. There's no mass capital ship fleet with accompanying heavy cruisers and so forth sitting in the eastern part of the channel worrying about the Kriegsmarine coming to stop them. Largely because there isn't much of a Kriegsmarine left by 1944, but that's I mean, to be honest, if apart magical logistics aside, if they pulled off D-Day at the time that they did Operation Husky in mid 1943, there's not exactly a tremendous amount of Kriegsmarine ships left at that point either. Mid 1943, you're basically worried about, can they get Tirpitz operational after the latest attempt to cripple it, and it's basically that and Scharnhorst is the sum total of German capital naval assets. After which they're down to maybe Deutschland and Admiral Scheer, and whatever, and Admiral Hipper, and then they're really and Prince Eugen, and that's it. Whereas you look at what the Regia Marina theoretically could have thrown at Husky or the landings in southern Italy.
Yeah, they still had
There's quite,
three littorials because the
yeah.
Roma was operational. There were by Husky there were only one heavy cruiser left, but there were still quite some light cruisers. The problem was that, of course, the naphtha was not there, so they could move. Then the problem is that to move away from the range of Allied strategic bombers, they had relocated first from Taranto to Naples, then from Naples to La Spezia, which is in the north of the Tyrrhenian Sea.
Yeah.
But again, they were nevertheless visited many times before Husky began. They were hit. The Roma and the Littorio were hit several times, and then they had to cross the whole Tyrrhenian Sea, facing the threat of Allied submarines, then circumvent Sicily, attack the landing zone, and with against the overwhelming Allied air power. And most importantly, there were not enough destroyers left to escort them. So at this point, it was kind of mad to think about their intervention in the operation. Yeah. So we could go conclude. I wanted to make some short comments on the ship designs. So so here we have the paper ships, the first condottieri class that Alex has covered very well in his mini series on the Italian cruisers. So these were the first light cruisers developed under the treaty condition. Again, they were envisaged to wage this guerrilla war against the French in the Western Mediterranean. But then, of course, the Italian first became very critical of this because they were not satisfied with the design for the stability, sea stability, armor protection, and so on. And then, we have the Cadorna class, which is a minor upgrade, but still not able to solve the problems. Then here again, the Cadorna. I wanted your opinion on this, on the Montecuccoli and the Duca d'Aosta types, because they are not often discussed, and I think they deserve some more attention. They are all the four ships survived. I mean, no, one ship was bombed in Naples, but they were never able to find the resources to repair it, and so it remained in semi-sunk in Naples. But these ships have actually survived. The other three ships survived the war, and they fought for the entire period of Italy's involvement in the war, and they were the last among the last operational ships of the Regia Marina. That the Regia Marina thought, we have almost no naphtha left, but if we have the naphtha left, we can send these ships together with the Duca degli Abruzzi class. Have you read any reports or interesting stuff on these ships?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about them is, at least for me, is that they actually compare relatively favorably to contemporary Allied designs in their weight region. And I think this is one of the things where sometimes it's very easy for certainly scholars in the English speaking world to make a mistake, because usually if you see these two classes compared, people will look at something like a Brooklyn class, a Cleveland class, or a Town class, and they'll go, oh well, the Allied ships, they've got more guns, they've got more armor, etc., etc. The Italians thing, the only thing they have is their speed, and to a certain extent, that's probably a good chunk of where you get this kind of pop culture. Oh yeah, the Italian cruisers were basically tin cans that could move really quickly, and that was it. Maybe the Giusanos at the beginning, that's a bit more of a deserved reputation. But when you get to the Montecuccoli and the Duca d'Aosta classes, you've got to bear in mind that they're 7,000-8,000 tons. They're not 10,000. at which point you can't really compare them with the Brooklyns, the Clevelands, and the Towns. You have to compare them with something like, say, the Leanders, which is kind of about 7,500 tons. So they're roughly on a parity in terms of displacement. And then so you compare them to a Leander, and well, all three classes have 8 6-inch guns in 4 twin turrets. So, main armament is much of a muchness. The Italians, at least at first, as built, actually have a slightly larger anti-aircraft battery. There's 6 heavy anti-aircraft guns, as opposed to 4 on the Leanders. Now, granted, as the war goes on, the Leanders replace their single 4s with twin 4s, so they go up to 8. But heavy AA, it's much of a muchness, I think, overall. Light AA is light AA. That changes on every ship, like every 5 minutes in World War II. At which point, then you look at protection. And in theory, the Leanders have slightly greater protection around the magazines, but it's this box protection that the British have brought in specifically to provide significant protection to the bit that might explode at the expense of almost any protection to the machinery spaces. So it's kind of neither here nor there, I think, with armor. Yeah, the Italian ships are possibly slightly more likely to take a round to the magazine and go pop, but at the same time, they're slightly less likely to take a round to the machinery spaces and get slowed down and killed anyway. And then you have speed. Now, obviously, in that case, the Italians are significantly faster than the Leanders. There's no real arguing with that. At which point, in terms of actual ship design, they're perfectly creditable vessels, especially because they're also about contemporary with the Leanders as well. It's not like the Italians are building these 5 years after the Leanders and coming up with something that's about as good. If you're going to build a light cruiser on 7,500, 8,000 tons, you're going to make compromises somewhere or another. And essentially, the Italians have made very slight compromises on protection in exchange for speed. Whereas the Leanders, as I said, theoretically, at least for the magazines, have fractionally better protection at the expense of being somewhat slower. So they're perfectly, they're perfectly creditable warships.
Yeah, and actually the Duca d'Aosta and the Montecuccolo are very, very similar also from the appearance, but the Duca d'Aosta series, they increased the level of protection a little bit more. Yeah, it took the first 6 condottieri to get it right, let's say. But
yeah, I mean, initially they're looking at them. Initially, the first generation, they're more looking at them as ways of taking on the French super destroyers. At which point it's like that again. Yes, taking a 5,000-ton high-speed 6-inch ship into action when it's got basically no protection against other cruisers is not necessarily the world's smartest plan. But that's not the plan the Italians had for those ships.
Yeah. Then I forgot to include the picture. That's my fault. But I also wanted to ask you something. The same basically on the Abruzzi class, because the ship that I call a heavy cruiser in the body of the light cruiser in the body of a heavy cruiser.
Yeah.
Because it bears the 6-inch guns, because 152 it's 6-inch, right?
Yeah.
So but then you see the belt armor, and again it's 130 millimeters, so more than the Deutschland class again.
And pretty quick for it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways, I mean, obviously they've got the weight. They've got a fair bit of protection to them. So again, they're fairly competitive. And actually, when you look at their displacement, it's actually very tempting to compare them to HMS Belfast, because yes, they are over the treaty limits, but so was Belfast, because Belfast and Edinburgh were designed and built as outgrowths of the Town class once it became clear that the treaty restrictions were not quite as much of a a thing. So, Belfast displaces around about 11,000 tons, at least initially. The Abruzes are in the same boat. Armor protection is broadly similar, even if the layout is somewhat different. The Italian ship is slightly faster. The flip side is it has slightly less overall firepower, because it's 10 guns against 12, eight heavy AA against 12 actually as well for Belfast in particular. So again, it's a slight compromise in both cases. The Italian ships are going for slightly more speed, which means slightly larger machinery, slightly more volume in that. The protection's not bad, but they're making very slight sacrifices in armament to do so. Although the other thing I do find somewhat interesting when it comes to the Abruzes is that, as you say, it's kind of, they are a light cruiser armament on a heavy cruiser body, which is kind of the flip, not necessarily a complete inverse, but in an almost inverse to the Admiral Hippers. I mean, the Admiral Hippers are absolutely huge, horrifically inefficient ships, but they're heavy cruisers. But there was a plan, at least on paper, of doing a Hipper with light cruiser armament, which, it would have been interesting to see. But if you want to see what an Axis warship that's light cruiser armament on a heavy cruiser body looks like, you look at the Abruzes. I say that they're, again, this is the thing. It's like they're not bad ships. They're capable of going toe to toe with other ships in their similar weight class. But I think it's basically the Giosanos, those first four, that have kind of somehow managed to wreck the reputation of the rest of the Italian light cruisers. Partly because people don't consider like for like; they consider overmatches a lot of the time, and partly also just the fact that those first few are pretty fragile. But then again, in some ways, this can be, I think, an example of unconscious prejudice, because let's face it, it's not like the Atlanta class did particularly brilliantly when they first tried to commit them to service actions either. They went on to do pretty well as anti-aircraft cruisers, but everyone kind of quietly brushes aside the fact that actually putting an Atlanta, which is not exactly but broadly similar in purpose to the Giosanos, they didn't do particularly well fighting surface actions.
No. No, I think also the problem is that by calling them condottieri, the condottieri series, you mix them all up, and they are completely different ships, and built in different periods
for different roles.
Yeah, absolutely, for different roles. And actually, I remember the Bande Nere, which was the last surviving of the four Giussanos. In 1942, given the fact that the heavy cruiser ranks were shrinking, and also some light cruisers were damaged and in repairs, the poor Bande Nere took part, was recalled because it was placed in the reserve, and because after Cape Spada and Cape Bon, they were not anymore considered as worthy ships, given the circumstances. But then, given the lack of cruiser, they recalled the Giussano in service. And basically, you have at the second Sirte, you have maybe the most heterogeneous cruiser division under Admiral Parona. That it consists of the cruiser Gorizia, so Azzara class, no, now I don't remember if it was the Trento or the Trieste. I think the Trento, so a Trento class, and then the Bande Nere, a Giussano type, so the very heterogeneous class division of cruiser. So I think 1 hour and 30. So I think we have wrapped it up quite good. Ship designs and overall perceptions of each other, and so thank you, Drag, for participating, and Probably we'll do more stuff together in other channels, but also here. And maybe next time we will bring also Alex for a for a general discussion. And yeah, thank you everybody for watching us, and see you next time.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It was very fun.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.